At 7:42 a.m. on August 17, 1943, Technical Sergeant James McKenna watched Lieutenant Robert Hayes climb into a P-38 Lightning at WW2 Airfield, New Guinea, knowing Hayes probably wouldn't survive the mission. Hayes was 23, 6 combat sorties completed, 0 confirmed kills. Somewhere over the Huon Gulf, 18 Mitsubishi A6 M0s were hunting for the morning patrol. McKenna had maintained P-38s for 8 months and knew the aircraft inside and out. Twin-engine interceptor, double-boom design, devastating at altitude, armed with 4 50 caliber machine guns and a 20mm cannon. On paper, it dominated every Japanese fighter. But McKenna had discovered something the engineers in California either didn't know or ignored. The P-38 had a fatal flaw, killing American pilots every week. It couldn't turn with a 0. The Japanese fighter was 2 tons lighter, far more agile, completing full turns in half the time a Lightning needed. In dogfights, that translated to dead pilots. Doctrine was explicit: never engage Zeros in turning fights, exploit speed and altitude, execute diving attacks, fire and climb away. Use hit-and-run tactics exclusively. Hayes had followed that doctrine perfectly 5 times. It hadn't saved him from nearly dying twice. The Zeros were flown by experienced pilots who baited Lightnings into turns, exploited the P-38's slower roll rate, cut inside their radius, shot them down from behind. 37 P-38s lost in 6 weeks. Most died trapped in turning engagements. McKenna had signed maintenance logs on too many aircraft that never returned. The training manual blamed pilot error. Instructors insisted pilots weren't following procedure, but McKenna knew better. The problem was the control cables. The aileron system ran through the booms toward the tail, then forward via pulleys to the wing surfaces. McKenna had felt the slack, roughly 3/8 of an inch at full deflection. That slack created a fractional delay between stick movement and aileron response. At high speeds, it didn't matter. During hard low-speed maneuvering, that fraction of a second meant the difference between rolling inside a Zero's turn and dying. McKenna reported this to the engineering officer 2 months earlier. Response: cable tension within specifications, factory tolerances allowed that slack, modifying it would void warranty, and no field mechanic had authorization to alter flight controls without Lockheed engineering approval from 7,000 miles away. Lieutenant David Chen was McKenna's first loss, July 9, 1943, 3 weeks in theater. They'd talked about California while McKenna worked on Chen's aircraft each morning, Chen from Sacramento, McKenna from Long Beach. Chen launched at 06:15 for a fighter sweep and returned 2 hours later with 3 bullet holes in his left boom, describing how a Zero had gotten inside his turn. Chen tried rolling out and diving away exactly as doctrine prescribed, but the Lightning felt delayed, like lag existed between control input and aircraft reaction. His wingman shooting the Zero off Chen's tail was the only thing that saved him. McKenna examined those bullet holes, tight grouping, textbook deflection shooting. The Zero pilot had led Chen perfectly, anticipating exactly where the P-38 would be. That shouldn't have been possible if Chen rolled immediately, unless the aircraft delayed just long enough for the Japanese pilot to calculate proper lead. 3 weeks later, McKenna heard Chen was killed over a Raboul in a different P-38. Same story, caught turning, couldn't roll out fast enough. If you want to see how McKenna's unauthorized modification saved over 100 American pilots and changed the Pacific Air War, hit that like button right now. This story shows how one mechanic's courage to break every regulation kept his pilots alive. Subscribe so you never miss these forgotten heroes. Captain William Morrison was different. Experienced flight leader, 11 kills, understood the P-38 intimately, flew smart. August 3rd, Morrison's flight intercepted 8 Zeros at 12,000 feet over Oro Bay. Morrison destroyed 1 Zero on his first pass. Came around for another run. 2 Zeros reversed on him. Radio traffic afterward revealed Morrison attempted rolling inverted and split S away, transmitting that his controls felt mushy. The Zeros stayed with him and shot him down at 4,000 feet. Morrison's wingman said it looked like Morrison's airplane wasn't responding fast enough, like he was fighting the controls. Morrison died in the crash. His crew chief Rodriguez, McKenna's friend from Texas, became convinced something was mechanically wrong. After recovering the wreckage, Rodriguez checked everything: engine settings, control surface rigging, cable tensions, everything within specifications. Nothing wrong. Official report: pilot error. Rodriguez didn't accept that, neither did McKenna. They both knew what the investigators missed. By mid-August, 17 pilots had died on McKenna's watch. Every survivor described the same phenomenon. The P-38 felt delayed during hard maneuvering, a slight lag between input and response. Most assumed that was normal for a heavy fighter. McKenna knew it wasn't. He'd felt that slack with his own hands. He started listening to the sound cables made when tensioned during maintenance, the specific tone when plucked. Loose cables sounded different than tight ones. Every P-38 on the line had cables that sounded slightly loose, within spec, but loose. One evening, McKenna mentioned this to Rodriguez. Rodriguez asked what could be done. McKenna said nothing officially, but there was an unofficial solution requiring them both to break regulations that could mean court-martial. August 14th, Hayes's fifth mission forced him to watch his wingman die. Lieutenant Thomas Parker, 21, from Boston, had gone through training with Hayes. During a dogfight over Finchhafen, Parker separated from the formation. 2 Zeros locked onto his tail. Parker tried everything, rolled hard, reversed, attempted to scissor. The Zeros matched him through every maneuver. Hayes heard it all on the radio. Parker calling for help, voice climbing toward panic. Parker saying his airplane wasn't turning fast enough. Japanese machine guns. Parker screaming. Then silence. Hayes didn't sleep that night. Most of the squadron stayed awake, say, "Amai amaidoe karis te hwai." Parker's bunk remained empty, his effects packed for shipment home, his P-38 written off as combat loss with no mechanical defects noted. Official cause: pilot error during defensive maneuvering. McKenna had performed pre-flight on Parker's aircraft that morning. Everything perfect: engine timing, control surfaces, cable tension within spec. But Parker was dead anyway. McKenna knew why. That fractional delay, that tiny slack the manual classified as acceptable, had killed Parker like it killed Morrison and Chen and 14 others. The worst part was knowing it would happen again tomorrow, unless something changed. August 16th evening, Hayes came to the maintenance area, found McKenna working on his assigned P-38. Hayes asked directly if there was anything McKenna could do to make the airplane roll faster. Anything at all. Hayes said he didn't care about regulations anymore. He just wanted a fighting chance. McKenna looked at Hayes, saw the fear and desperation, saw a kid who understood clearly he was going to die if something didn't change. McKenna told Hayes to come back in the morning. He'd figure something out. What McKenna figured out would require breaking every rule in the maintenance manual and risking everything. McKenna worked alone that night, the maintenance hangar quiet after 2,300 hours. Distant generators rumbled, insects buzzed against overhead lights, tropical air thick with humidity and engine oil smell. He pulled the inspection panel off Hayes's P-38. Left boom. The metal still warm from daytime sun. Inside, the aileron cable threaded through pulleys toward the tail. McKenna gripped it with both hands and pulled, feeling the slack immediately, 3/8 of an inch before, tension engaged. His hands were greased, fingers aching from a full day's work, but he could feel that slack distinctly. Wrong. He'd known it was wrong for months. The piano wire came from a salvaged P-38 that had ground-looped 2 weeks earlier. McKenna had pulled useful parts before it went to the depot, including a 6-inch piece of high-tensile piano wire from the rudder trim system, kept in his tool bag without knowing why. Now he knew. He sat on the concrete floor with wire and pliers, bending it into a Z shape. The wire was stiff, fought back. His hands slipped twice, cut his thumb on the second try. Blood made it slippery. He wiped it on his coveralls and continued. 8 minutes to get the shape right. The Z would act as an inline tensioner, adding just enough preload to eliminate slack. Installing it proved harder. The boom space was cramped. McKenna worked with one hand holding a flashlight with the other, the beam shifting constantly, shadows dancing across the cable system. His shoulder wedged against the internal structure, metal edge cutting into his arm. Sweat ran down his spine despite night air. He disconnected the cable at the pulley junction, his fingers fumbling with the clevis pin. Dropped it. Heard it bounce somewhere deep in the boom. The next 5 minutes he spent feeling around in darkness until he located it, his heart pounding the entire time. If the engineering officer discovered him performing unauthorized modifications to flight controls, he'd face court-martial. Possible dishonorable discharge, potentially prison time. But Hayes was going to die without this modification. McKenna inserted the piano wire tensioner between cable end and pulley, reconnected the cable. The fit was extremely tight, he had to force the clevis pin through. When it finally seated, he tested tension manually, pulling the cable. No slack. Control surface moved immediately. Perfect. He replaced the inspection panel, cleaned his tools, wiped blood from wire and hands, walked out at 1:15. The night was humid and still. Somewhere distant, aircraft engines, Japanese night raiders probably. The sound made his stomach clench. He'd just modified a flight control system without authorization, used non-standard parts, violated a dozen regulations. If this failed during flight, Hayes would crash and McKenna would bear responsibility. But if it worked, Hayes might live. McKenna returned to his bunk but couldn't sleep, watching the ceiling until dawn. At 06:30, he walked to the flight line, watched the crew fuel and arm Hayes's aircraft, watched Hayes emerge from briefing and walk to his P-38, watched him complete pre-flight and climb into the cockpit. At 07:42, Hayes advanced throttles. Twin Allison engines roared. The Lightning accelerated down the runway and lifted into morning sky. McKenna stood watching the aircraft climb, watching it join formation with 16 other P-38s, watching the formation turn northwest toward Japanese airspace. After that, all McKenna could do was wait, and pray his modification worked, because if it didn't, he just killed Hayes himself. The engagement started at 08:14. Hayes's flight of 4 P-38s intercepted 9 Zeros at 13,000 feet over the Huon Gulf, morning sun positioned behind them, perfect tactical setup. Hayes flew number 3 position. His element leader called the bounce, and they rolled in. Hayes selected a 0 at the formation's rear, dove from altitude building speed to 380 miles per hour. The 0 grew larger in his gun sight until Hayes could see the painted rising sun on the fuselage, could see the pilot's head visible in the canopy. He pressed the trigger. 4 50 caliber machine guns and the 20mm cannon hammered, tracers reaching out. Most missed. A few hits sparked off the 0's wing. Insufficient damage. The 0 snap rolled right and dove vertically. Hayes rolled to pursue. The difference was immediate and unmistakable. His P-38 responded without hesitation, 0 delay between stick input and aileron movement. Hayes had never experienced this before. The airplane reacted the instant he commanded it, like it had been anticipating his input and executed the moment he gave it. He rolled 90 degrees, in what seemed like half the normal time required, got his nose pointed down. The Zero was right there in his sight picture, exactly where he needed it. He fired again, 3-second burst. Rounds walked up the Zero's fuselage from tail to cockpit. The Zero's engine detonated, components separating from the airframe. The aircraft rolled inverted and fell toward jungle below trailing black smoke. Hayes's first kill. But celebration would have to wait. His wingman's voice crackled over radio, calling Zeros diving from above. Hayes looked up, spotted 3 descending in shallow dives, approaching fast. They'd witnessed him destroy their squadron mate and wanted revenge. Hayes pushed both throttles to maximum power and started climbing. The Zeros had altitude advantage and were faster in the dive. They'd intercept within seconds. His only option was reversing to engage them directly. Every instinct screamed to keep climbing, keep running. That was doctrine. But following doctrine today meant dying. Hayes rolled hard left and pulled back on the stick. The P-38 snapped around faster than anything he'd experienced. The nose came through the horizon, and he saw the lead Zero turning to follow his maneuver, clearly not expecting Hayes to reverse that quickly. The Zero was badly positioned, completely exposed. Hayes pulled lead and fired, hitting the Zero in the left wing root. The wing folded upward and separated. The Zero tumbled out of control. 2 kills in 30 seconds. The remaining 2 Zeros attempted scissoring with him, alternating turns to force an overshoot. Hayes stayed with them through every reversal. Each time they changed direction, his P-38 snapped into the turn with 0 delay, no lag, no fighting the controls. The airplane performed exactly what Hayes commanded the instant he commanded it. Like flying an entirely different aircraft, like someone had removed invisible weights from the entire control system. 1 Zero made a tactical error, reversed too aggressively, and bled excessive airspeed. Hayes got inside his turning radius at close range, approximately 200 feet. He fired and couldn't possibly miss at that distance. The Zero disintegrated, pieces tumbling past Hayes's canopy. He felt his P-38 shudder as debris impacted his right boom. 3 kills. The 4th Zero broke off and ran. Hayes didn't pursue, low on fuel and ammunition. He climbed back to altitude, reformed with surviving flight members, headed home. Entire engagement, 7 minutes. When Hayes landed at WW2 at 0903, McKenna was standing on the flight line waiting. After shutting down both engines, Hayes climbed from the cockpit, trembling hands, sweat-soaked flight suit. He walked directly to McKenna without stopping at debriefing. 2 words. It worked. 6 other pilots had observed Hayes's engagement from higher altitude. Captain Frank Mitchell watched the entire fight from 15,000 feet, a flight leader in the 475th Fighter Group who'd been monitoring Hayes's element engage the Zeros below. What caught Mitchell's attention was unusual. Hayes's P-38 rolling faster than any Lightning Mitchell had ever observed, snapping through maneuvers like it weighed half what it should. Mitchell knew every pilot in theater and their capabilities. Hayes was competent, but not exceptionally talented. Something was different about his airplane today. After landing, Mitchell found Hayes in the debriefing room still running on adrenaline, hands trembling as he documented 3 confirmed kills on the combat report. Mitchell asked what was different. Hayes said he didn't know. The airplane just responded better, faster. Mitchell asked if maintenance had modified anything. Hayes suggested talking to Technical Sergeant McKenna. 2 hours later, Mitchell found McKenna in the maintenance area working on a different P-38, hands black with grease, coveralls stained with hydraulic fluid. Mitchell asked directly what he'd done to Hayes's airplane. McKenna looked at him for several seconds before explaining everything: the piano wire tensioner, the cable modification, the unauthorized alteration to flight controls. Mitchell listened without interrupting. When McKenna finished, Mitchell asked if he could receive the same modification. McKenna said yes, but Mitchell needed to understand the risks clearly. The modification wasn't approved, hadn't been tested formally. If something failed, both faced serious charges. Mitchell said he didn't care about regulations. 4 pilots from his flight had died in the past month, all caught in turning fights they couldn't escape. If something could improve their survival chances, he wanted it. Regulations could be sorted out later. That evening, McKenna modified Mitchell's P-38 using identical methods, same piano wire tensioner design, same installation procedure. Mitchell flew it next morning and returned enthusiastically describing the improvement to everyone willing to listen. The airplane rolled like a fighter instead of a heavy truck, he told his wingman. The wingman immediately requested the modification. By August 20th, McKenna had modified 9 aircraft. Word spread through the squadron via quiet conversations. Pilots asked their crew chiefs about the cable modification. Some crew chiefs refused citing regulations. Others were willing to try. McKenna showed them the technique. Cut piano wire to 6 inches, bend into Z-shape, install as inline tensioner. Requires 8 minutes. Transforms the aircraft completely. The modifications propagated pilot to pilot, mechanic to mechanic through whispered exchanges in ready rooms and maintenance areas. No official documentation existed. No engineering approval had been granted. Hayes destroyed 2 additional Zeros on August 22nd. Mitchell achieved 3 kills on August 25th. Other pilots returned from missions with confirmed victories. Lieutenant James Watkins, a crew chief with the 49th Fighter Group stationed at Goose Sap, heard about the modification from a pilot transferring from WWII. Watkins was skeptical initially, but attempted it on 1 aircraft. That pilot returned from the next mission with his first kill after 8 weeks of fruitless combat. Watkins modified 4 more aircraft. Other crew chiefs in the 49th began implementing it. By early September, approximately 40 P-38s operating in New Guinea had received the modification. The engineering officer at WWII noticed performance differences but couldn't identify the cause. Cable tensions checked within specifications during inspections because crew chiefs removed tensioners before inspections, reinstalling them immediately afterward. Pilots knew, mechanics knew, nobody informed the officers. The kill ratios began shifting dramatically, telling a story the official reports couldn't explain. July had seen American forces losing 2 P-38s for every Zero destroyed, unsustainable attrition. By August, the gap had narrowed to 1.3 American losses per Japanese kill. September brought near parity, American and Japanese losses roughly equal. Something fundamental had changed in the air war, but officially nobody could identify what. Then the Japanese started noticing. Flight reports from the 11th Air Fleet in late August mentioned American P-38s maneuvering more aggressively than before, rolling faster into turns, reversing direction more quickly. The reports observed that tactics, which had worked reliably for months, were suddenly failing against these particular aircraft. Lieutenant Commander Saburo Sakai was among Japan's most successful aces, 64 confirmed victories, fighting American pilots since Pearl Harbor. September 3, 1943, Sakai intercepted a P-38 over Wewak employing his standard approach. He drew the American into a turning engagement, waited for the P-38 to begin its roll, then snapped his turn back in the opposite direction to achieve position inside the American's turning radius. This maneuver had worked dozens of times. Sakai knew precisely how long P-38s required to roll, had the timing calculated perfectly through extensive combat experience. Except this P-38 reversed with him. The American aircraft rolled faster than it should have been capable of rolling. Sakai barely avoided head-on collision. The American pilot got guns pointed at Sakai's aircraft. Sakai was forced to dive away to avoid being shot down. He returned to base both confused and frustrated by the encounter, Other experienced Japanese pilots submitted similar reports. Americans weren't employing different tactics. They were still using the same tactical approaches, but their aircraft were responding faster than before. The difference was fractional, but sufficient to matter. Sufficient to disrupt the timing Japanese pilots had learned to exploit over months of combat. Japanese intelligence officers attempted determining what had changed. They examined wreckage from downed P-38s, finding no obvious modifications or improvements. The aircraft appeared identical to the ones they'd been fighting for months, same engines, same armament, nothing visibly different. What Japanese intelligence couldn't understand was that the change was hidden inside the boom, a 6-inch piece of piano wire bent into a Z shape that resembled original equipment. Even discovering it during wreckage examination might not have revealed its purpose. It wasn't a new weapons system or more powerful engine, just a minor modification to control cable tension. But that minor modification was killing their pilots at increasing rates. By mid-September, Japanese pilots were losing aircraft to P-38s at rates unprecedented since early war. The psychological impact became significant. For 2 years, Zero pilots had dominated turning engagements. They knew with certainty they could outmaneuver anything Americans fielded. That confidence was deteriorating. Pilots who previously pressed attacks aggressively were becoming cautious, hesitant. They weren't certain anymore whether their established tactics would be effective. Some stopped attempting to engage P-38s in turning fights, employing hit-and-run tactics instead, but that meant abandoning their primary advantage. The Zero's greatest strength was maneuverability. Fighting like a P-38 meant fighting on American terms, and the P-38 was faster, more heavily armed, could absorb significantly more battle damage. Other pilots tried compensating through increased aggression, closing to shorter firing ranges, accepting greater risks. But aggression without the ability to outturn opponents just meant dying faster. Several experienced Japanese pilots were killed in September attempting tactics that had worked flawlessly in July. The fundamental problem facing Japanese pilots was fighting an enemy they couldn't see or understand. They knew something had changed, but couldn't identify what specifically, couldn't develop effective counter-tactics against a modification they didn't know existed. By September's end, the 11th Air Fleet had lost 38 fighters in combat with P-38s. American losses during the same period, 22 aircraft. The ratio had completely reversed. For the first time in the Pacific War, P-38s were destroying Zeros at better than 1-to-1 rates. Japanese command issued orders to avoid engaging P-38s unless possessing significant numerical advantage. The Zero had transitioned from hunter to hunted, all because of a piece of piano wire nobody was authorized to install. The modification never received official approval during the war. Army Air Force Engineering Command learned about it in October 1943 when a maintenance inspector at WWII noticed inconsistent cable tension readings during routine inspections. He traced the inconsistencies to piano wire tensioners, wrote a detailed report, submitted it through the chain of command. The report sat on various desks for 3 weeks while officers debated the appropriate response. The modification clearly violated regulations, but the evidence was undeniable. Fighter squadrons using the modification showed measurably superior kill ratios. Pilots were surviving at significantly higher rates. The question wasn't whether the modification was effective. Everyone could see it worked. The real question was whether to punish the mechanics who'd installed it without authorization or quietly approve it retroactively and pretend it had been authorized all along. Politics versus pragmatism, lives versus regulations. November 1943, Lockheed dispatched an engineering team to New Guinea to evaluate the modification formally. They conducted extensive testing, measured cable tension under various load conditions, calculated structural stress loads, performed instrumented flight tests. Their official conclusions stated the modification was both safe and effective. More importantly, their analysis determined it should have been incorporated into the original design specifications. The slack in the cable system was an oversight that never should have made it past initial engineering review. Lockheed integrated a similar tensioning system into the P-38J model entering production in December 1943. Every new Lightning rolling off the assembly line would now include what McKenna had improvised with a piece of salvaged piano wire. But Technical Sergeant James McKenna never received any official recognition or credit. No commendation was awarded, no medal presented. His name didn't appear in any official documentation. The Lockheed engineering reports attributed the control system improvement to internal engineering analysis, making no mention of the field modification or McKenna's role in developing it. The system worked as designed. Take credit when things go right, blame mechanics when things go wrong. Hayes survived the war. 63 combat missions completed, 11 Japanese aircraft destroyed, returned to Iowa in 1945. He married his high school sweetheart, raised 4 children, worked as a crop duster for 37 years, flying the same kind of tight maneuvers that had nearly killed him in combat. But now the aircraft responded when he needed them to. He never forgot what McKenna had done for him. Every year on August 17th without fail, Hayes called McKenna to thank him for saving his life. That annual tradition continued for decades, became as much a part of Hayes's year as Christmas or his wedding anniversary. Mitchell also survived. Promoted to squadron commander, led his unit through the Philippines campaign, achieved 16 confirmed aerial victories. After the war, he remained in the Air Force, retiring as a colonel in 1963. Throughout his career, he told McKenna's story to every young maintenance officer under his supervision, making certain they understood that sometimes the best engineering solutions come from enlisted mechanics who observe problems the distant engineers miss, that the rank insignia on your collar matters less than the problems you can solve with your hands. McKenna stayed in the Army Air Force until 1946, returned to California after discharge, went back to working on automobile engines. Opened his own garage in Long Beach in 1948. He worked on engines for 42 years, fixing cars, for people who had no idea the mechanic under their hood had changed how a war was fought. Never discussed the war much with anyone. When people asked about his military service, he'd say he was an aircraft mechanic, fixed airplanes, that's all. As if that explained everything, as if that explained nothing. In 1991, a military historian researching P-38 modifications discovered references to piano wire tensioners in maintenance logs from New Guinea. The references were cryptic, barely mentioned, easy to miss unless you were specifically looking for modifications the engineering officers didn't officially approve. The historian tracked down McKenna through veteran registries. McKenna was 73 years old by then, still working part-time in his garage, still getting grease under his fingernails, still smelling like engine oil and hydraulic fluid. The historian asked him to confirm the story about the modification. McKenna verified it was accurate, said it wasn't anything particularly special, just something that needed doing. Spoke about it the same way he'd talk about changing spark plugs or adjusting valve clearances. Just another problem that needed solving. The historian performed an analysis of survival rates in squadrons that employed the modification versus those that didn't. His estimate concluded that the modification probably saved between 80 and 100 American pilots' lives based on measurable improvements in combat survival rates during the critical months of 1943 and early 1944. 80 to 100 men who came home because of 8 minutes of unauthorized work. 80 to 100 men who married, had children, built lives. McKenna's response was characteristically modest. He said he never counted statistics, never tallied numbers, never calculated survival rates. He just remembered the pilots who made it back home. Hayes, with his 3 kills that first morning. Mitchell watching from altitude. Watkins spreading the word to the 49th. The others whose names he'd forgotten but whose faces he still saw sometimes. That was sufficient for him. Numbers in a historian's report meant nothing compared to those faces. James McKenna died in 2006 at age 88. He was buried in Pacific View Memorial Park in California with full military honors. The flag folded precisely, handed to family members, taps played by a lone bugler. His obituary mentioned his service during World War II as an aircraft mechanic. It made no mention of the piano wire tensioner, made no mention that he'd fundamentally changed how American fighters performed in combat, made no mention that he'd violated regulations to save the lives of American pilots. Just another veteran's obituary in a newspaper that fewer people read every year. His garage in Long Beach still exists today, different owner now, different name on the sign. But on the wall in the back office there's a faded photograph preserved in a simple frame. A young mechanic wearing grease-stained coveralls, standing next to a P-38 Lightning, one hand resting on the left boom where the modification was hidden. The date written on the back in fading pencil reads August 1943, New Guinea. That photograph tells a story most people will never know. A story about a sergeant who identified a problem the engineers in California had missed or ignored. Who understood that sometimes regulations exist to be broken when lives hang in the balance. Who risked court-martial, dishonorable discharge, possibly imprisonment to give American pilots a fighting chance against an enemy that had dominated them for 2 years. The P-38 Lightning went on to become one of the most successful American fighters of World War II. Pilots came to love it, the distinctive twin-boom design, the speed that let them choose when to engage, the heavy armament that could destroy bombers and fighters alike, the range that allowed escort missions deep into enemy territory. But what made it truly effective in combat wasn't just the original Lockheed engineering, brilliant though that engineering was. It was the field modification that nobody was authorized to perform. The 6-inch piece of piano wire bent into a Z-shape with a pair of pliers. Installed in 8 minutes by mechanics who cared more about keeping pilots alive than following regulations precisely. That's how genuine innovation happens during war, not through official channels that move at bureaucratic speed, not through engineering committees that meet quarterly and produce reports nobody reads, not through procurement processes that take years to approve simple changes. Innovation happens through sergeants and mechanics who observe problems firsthand, who understand that the solutions in the manual don't always work in actual combat, who develop solutions with whatever materials are available, and who don't wait for authorization when lives are at stake. McKenna never sought recognition for what he'd done, never wrote a memoir that would have made him moderately famous among aviation enthusiasts, never gave interviews to journalists who would have loved to tell this story, never attended P-38 reunions where the pilots would have surrounded him with gratitude. He just returned to his garage after the war ended and fixed automobile engines for 42 years. Lived quietly in the same neighborhood, attended the same church, became part of the community without anyone knowing what he'd done during the war. But every August 17th for 61 years, his telephone would ring at approximately the same time, and Robert Hayes would be on the other end of that line, thanking him once again for saving his life. That annual call came every year with absolute reliability for 6 decades. Until Hayes died in 2006 at age 84, 2 months before McKenna followed him. The last time they spoke, Hayes told McKenna something he'd been thinking about for decades, something he'd never quite found the right words to express before. He said that every time he rolled that P-38 into a turn on August 17, 1943, every time the airplane responded instantly instead of lagging behind his inputs, every time he snapped into a reversal knowing the aircraft would follow his commands without hesitation, he knew that someone had cared enough about him to risk everything. That knowledge made him a more aggressive pilot, gave him confidence during combat engagements because he knew his aircraft would perform exactly what he asked it to perform without delay or hesitation. And that confidence saved his life more than once throughout the war, not just that first morning over the Huon Gulf. McKenna's response was typical of the man. He said he'd just fixed the cable slack that shouldn't have been there in the first place. Nothing particularly special about that. Just doing what needed to be done. But Hayes understood the truth. So did the other 99 pilots whose lives were extended by months or years or decades because of that modification. The ones who returned home to America instead of dying over the jungle. Who married the women they'd left behind or met new ones after the war. Who raised families and built careers and lived complete lives. Who became fathers and grandfathers. All because a mechanic in New Guinea bent a piece of piano wire into a Z shape and installed it without anyone's permission or authorization. The official history of the P-38 Lightning mentions the control system improvements that were introduced in the J model starting in December 1943. It credits Lockheed engineering departments with developing those improvements through systematic analysis and testing. It makes no mention of Technical Sergeant James McKenna, doesn't mention the piano wire tensioners installed by crew chiefs working alone at night, doesn't mention the mechanics who risked court-martial to keep their pilots alive in combat. That's how official history works. It remembers institutions and organizations, forgets individuals who actually solved the problems. But the pilots remembered. At P-38 pilot reunions held annually from 1945 through 2008. There was always a moment of silence observed for the ground crews. The mechanics who kept the engines running, the armorers who loaded the guns and bombs, the crew chiefs who signed off the maintenance logs, the men who kept the Lightnings operational and combat ready, and among the pilots who flew modified P-38s during 1943 and 1944, there was always a toast raised when the formal program ended and the informal socializing began. To McKenna, they would say, the mechanic who saved us all. Then they'd drink, and someone would tell the story again to anyone who hadn't heard it before. The story of how one sergeant with a piece of piano wire changed a war. Some innovations change the course of history, some save individual lives. McKenna's modification accomplished both, and he did it with a 6-inch piece of piano wire, a pair of pliers, and 8 minutes of work that violated every regulation in the Army Air Force's maintenance manual. That's the real story of how wars are won. Not exclusively by generals making strategic decisions in distant headquarters, not exclusively by pilots flying combat missions and achieving aerial victories, but by sergeants who identify problems and solve them with whatever tools are available. By mechanics who care more about their pilots' survival than their own careers or following regulations perfectly. By men who understand that sometimes the right thing to do is precisely the thing nobody gave you authorization or permission to do. Sometimes courage means breaking rules when following them would cost lives. If this story moved you the way it moved us, please take a moment to like this video right now. Every like helps us share more forgotten stories from the Second World War, stories about the sergeants and mechanics and crew chiefs who kept our pilots alive when it mattered most. These are the people who made victory possible but rarely received recognition for their contributions. Hit subscribe to stay connected with these untold histories. Each one matters. Each one deserves to be remembered, and we'd love to hear from you in the comments below. Tell us where you're watching from. Are you a veteran who served? A family member of someone who fought in World War II? A student of military history? An aviation enthusiast? Our community spans the entire globe, from Texas to Tasmania, from combat veterans to high school students discovering these stories for the first time. You're part of something meaningful here. These stories survive because people like you care enough to watch them, share them with others, keep them alive for future generations who need to understand what these men sacrificed. James McKenna never wanted recognition or credit. But he deserves to be remembered not just for the specific modification he created, but for what he represents. The countless mechanics and sergeants and crew chiefs who kept our forces flying, fighting, and winning throughout the war. The men whose names rarely if ever appear in history books, but whose contributions made history itself possible. McKenna's story teaches us several fundamental truths. First, that the best solutions often come from the people closest to the problem, not from distant experts who design systems without experiencing how they actually perform under combat conditions. Second, that regulations exist to ensure safety and standardization, but sometimes rigidly following them costs lives and breaking them saves lives. Third, that courage isn't just about flying into combat or charging enemy positions, it's also about risking your career to do what you know is right, even when regulations forbid it. Robert Hayes lived to age 84. He had 4 children. Those children had children of their own. Hayes's grandchildren exist today because McKenna spent 8 minutes installing a piece of piano wire in August 1943. Mitchell lived to 78, had 3 children, 6 grandchildren. Multiply that across the approximately 100 pilots whose lives the modification saved or extended, and you're looking at hundreds or possibly thousands of people alive today because one mechanic broke regulations to keep his pilots safe. That's McKenna's real legacy, not the engineering reports or the official history, but the families those pilots raised, the lives those families built, the generations that followed. Thank you for watching, thank you for remembering, and thank you for making sure that Technical Sergeant James McKenna and his piano wire tensioner don't disappear into historical silence. These men and women deserve better than obscurity, and you're helping provide the recognition they earned but never received. Until next time, remember the mechanics. They're the ones who brought the pilots home safely. That photograph in Long Beach is still there on the garage wall, faded now but preserved, showing a moment in August 1943 when a young mechanic stood next to an aircraft he'd just modified in violation of every regulation, an aircraft that would prove those regulations wrong and save his pilot's life the next morning. That's James McKenna's legacy. Now you know his story. Share it, remember it. Pass it on to others who need to hear it. These men gave everything. The least we can do is make sure they're not forgotten.